Heather Thompson stood quietly beside her husband as the reunion dinner celebrated success, ambition, and old friendships. Then Mark Reynolds raised his glass, smiled at the crowd, and turned her into the evening's joke. He laughed that she had contributed nothing to his life except occupying the empty chair beside him. The room answered with scattered laughter. Heather neither defended herself nor walked away. She simply watched every face in silence. None of them, not Mark, not his former classmates, not even the event organizers, knew that the woman they had just humiliated had already purchased the luxury resort hosting their reunion. Before the night was over, the truth would arrive through signatures, records, and the law, not anger. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from and what your local time is. If you believe dignity always outlasts arrogance, consider subscribing so you won't miss the next story where quiet strength speaks louder than pride. Fan 2. Heather Thompson had long ago learned that the strongest people in a room were rarely the loudest. It was a lesson her father had repeated throughout her childhood, though he had never spoken it like a lecture. William Thompson believed that character revealed itself during ordinary moments, not extraordinary victories. Whenever negotiations became tense or competitors underestimated him, he would simply smile, listen, and continue collecting information. Only when every document had been reviewed and every fact verified would he make his decision. Heather inherited that habit long before she inherited anything else. At 36, she lived with a quiet routine that surprised nearly everyone who met her. She woke before sunrise, brewed her own coffee instead of hiring household staff, kept handwritten notebooks beside her desk, and preferred listening to asking unnecessary questions. Her closest friends often joked that Heather could notice details most people never even saw. She never argued with them. She simply smiled and continued writing. The notebooks filled shelves in her home office. Some contained investment research. Others held observations from business meetings. Several documented conversations that seemed insignificant at first, but later proved surprisingly important. Heather did not keep records because she distrusted people. She kept them because memory could become unreliable when emotions grew louder than facts. That principle had shaped every important decision in her adult life. Her husband, Mark Reynolds, had once admired that calmness. Years earlier, when they first met at the University of Colorado, he often told friends Heather made him feel grounded. While other students competed for attention, she remained content sitting beneath old oak trees with a finance textbook resting on her knees. She rarely interrupted anyone. She asked thoughtful questions instead of trying to impress people with clever answers. Mark had fallen in love with that quiet confidence. At least, he believed he had. Back then, neither of them possessed much money. Mark worked evenings delivering food while studying business administration. Heather held internships during the summer and tutored accounting students on weekends. They shared inexpensive meals, celebrated birthdays with homemade desserts, and dreamed about futures that seemed impossibly distant. Those memories still lived vividly inside Heather. She wondered sometimes whether they survived anywhere inside Mark as well. After graduation, life became considerably harder than either of them expected. The economy slowed. Companies delayed hiring. Mark submitted dozens of applications without receiving meaningful offers. Each rejection affected him more deeply than the previous one. Heather watched his confidence disappear little by little. She never criticized him. Instead, she encouraged him to continue improving his proposals, reviewing presentations with him late into the night until he felt prepared for the next interview. What Mark never discovered was that Heather had quietly reached out to someone she trusted, not to secure him a job through favoritism, only to ensure that someone would actually read his application. The contact belonged to an investment group that had done business with William Thompson for decades. Heather deliberately avoided mentioning her father's name. She simply asked whether a talented graduate deserved an honest opportunity. A month later, Mark received an invitation to interview with a consulting firm. He earned the position on his own ability. Heather never claimed credit. Years passed. Mark proved intelligent, hardworking, and ambitious. Promotions followed. His salary increased. Clients praised his confidence during negotiations. He eventually left the firm to establish his own strategic consulting company. Heather celebrated every achievement as though it belonged equally to both of them. She believed that marriage meant sharing victories without keeping score. Yet success changed something subtle inside Mark. At first, it appeared only in small conversations. He corrected people more frequently. He became impatient when restaurant service felt slow. He started measuring acquaintances according to job titles rather than kindness. Heather noticed each change. She wrote nothing about them, not because they were unimportant, because she hoped they would disappear. Instead, they multiplied. Business magazines praised Mark's rapid career growth. Professional conferences invited him as a speaker. Social media rewarded every photograph featuring luxury hotels, expensive watches, and networking events. Gradually, admiration became something he no longer appreciated. It became something he expected. The more recognition he received, the less he seemed able to imagine life without it. Heather rarely attended those events unless Mark specifically asked. Large crowds exhausted her. Meaningless conversations interested her even less. She preferred spending weekends reviewing investment reports or visiting charitable organizations that received funding through the Thompson family trust. Few people connected Heather to that foundation. The trust deliberately avoided public attention. William Thompson had insisted upon anonymity throughout his lifetime. "If people thank your name instead of your work," he once told Heather, "your priorities have already shifted." After William passed away 3 years earlier, Heather became the principal trustee. The legal transition attracted little media attention because ownership remained inside private investment entities rather than public corporations. Even Mark understood remarkably little about the family trust. Heather never lied to him. When he asked about her responsibilities, she answered honestly, "I oversee investments." That statement happened to describe hundreds of millions of dollars. Mark interpreted it as middle management financial work. Heather never corrected his assumption. She had once considered explaining everything. Several times, in fact, especially during the first years of marriage. But every attempt felt strangely unnecessary. She wanted Mark to love the woman who sat across from him during quiet dinners, not the balance sheets connected to her last name. Eventually, silence became habit. Then habit became normal life. One autumn evening, while Mark scrolled through messages after work, he suddenly smiled. "The reunion committee finally picked a venue," he announced. Heather looked up from her notebook. "Our 15-year reunion." "Exactly." He opened the digital invitation. Luxury accommodations, black-tie dinner, executive networking breakfast, investment panels, charity auction, 3-day celebration. "It'll be incredible," Mark said. "Everyone who's accomplished something will be there." Heather accepted the phone and read through the schedule. The location sounded familiar, very familiar. She recognized the name of the lakeside resort because one of her investment teams had been evaluating the property for several months. She quietly handed the phone back. "It looks beautiful." Mark leaned against the kitchen counter. "You should probably buy something more elegant to wear." Heather smiled faintly. "I have formal dresses. I mean, something people will remember." She looked at him. "They're coming to reconnect with classmates. They're also coming to see who's succeeded." Heather noticed the certainty in his voice. Not excitement, expectation. He continued speaking. Jason sold his software company. Ethan became a surgeon. Amanda's a television anchor. Everyone will compare lives. Heather poured another cup of tea before answering. I don't think life is a competition. Mark laughed softly. It shouldn't be. Then he added, almost absent-mindedly, but everyone keeps score anyway. The words lingered in the kitchen after the conversation ended. Heather did not argue. She simply wrote the reunion dates into the small notebook resting beside her cup. Below them, she added one quiet sentence. Sometimes people reveal who they have become before they realize anyone is listening. She closed the notebook. Outside evening settled gently across the neighborhood. Inside the house, neither husband nor wife understood that the upcoming reunion would become far more than a weekend of old memories. For Mark, it would become the moment every assumption he had built about success would begin to collapse. For Heather, it would become the final opportunity to discover whether the man she had married still existed beneath the ambition that now defined him. Neither outcome would arrive through shouting. Neither would depend upon revenge. Both would be decided by truth. The reunion invitation remained on the kitchen counter for nearly a week. Mark Reynolds looked at it several times each day, though he no longer needed to. He had already memorized the schedule, the guest list, and the names of the classmates he hoped to impress. Every spare moment became another opportunity to imagine conversations that had not yet happened. Heather Thompson noticed the change without mentioning it. She watched him practice introductions while shaving in the morning. She heard him casually mention his company's recent contracts during phone calls that had nothing to do with business. She even caught him searching online for several former classmates studying their careers as though preparing for an examination. It was unlike the young man she had fallen in love with. College-aged Mark had wanted to build a meaningful career because he believed hard work created freedom. Now he seemed determined to prove something to people he had not seen in 15 years. Heather wondered when ambition had quietly transformed into comparison. She never asked. Some questions accomplished nothing except making people defensive. Instead, she focused on her own responsibilities. On Tuesday morning, while Mark was attending a client meeting downtown, Heather drove to the headquarters of Thompson Capital Management, a discreet investment company occupying the upper floors of a modern office building in Denver. There was no enormous company logo outside. No extravagant lobby designed to impress visitors. William Thompson had disliked unnecessary displays of wealth. The firm's reputation had always traveled faster than its advertising. As Heather stepped out of the elevator onto the executive floor, several employees greeted her warmly. "Good morning, Miss Thompson." She smiled politely. "Good morning." The respect she received never came from fear. Most of the senior employees had worked alongside her father for decades. They had watched Heather grow from a curious teenager sitting quietly in conference rooms into an investor whose decisions reflected patience rather than impulse. Benjamin Carter was already waiting in the conference room. The attorney stood as she entered. "Good morning, Heather." "Morning, Ben." Benjamin had served as legal counsel to the Thompson family for almost 20 years. Meticulous, calm, and incapable of rushing important decisions, he reminded Heather of her father in many ways. A thick folder rested on the polished walnut table. Benjamin slid it toward her. The acquisition committee approved the final closing documents yesterday. Heather opened the folder carefully. Every page contained signatures, banking confirmations, property assessments, and regulatory approvals collected over months of negotiations. The purchase had been anything but simple. The lakeside resort had changed ownership several times during the previous decade. Complicated financing agreements and multiple investors had delayed every serious offer. Heather's team had spent nearly 8 months reviewing financial statements, environmental reports, employee contracts, maintenance records, and future development opportunities before making a proposal. She had visited the property personally on 3 occasions. Not once had she introduced herself as the buyer. Instead, she had walked the grounds like an ordinary guest. She spoke with housekeeping staff. She asked restaurant servers about employee turnover. She chatted with maintenance workers repairing walking paths around the lake. Some investors measured buildings. Heather measured people. A profitable resort meant very little if the employees had lost hope. Benjamin adjusted his glasses. The final wire transfer cleared at 9:23 this morning. Heather nodded. So it's official. It is. He handed her another document. This confirms Thompson Legacy Holdings now owns 100% of the property. Heather studied the paperwork carefully before signing the final authorization. She never signed anything she had not personally reviewed. Even after years of experience, that habit remained unchanged. Benjamin collected the completed documents. There is one remaining issue. Heather looked up. The announcement. He nodded. The board recommends delaying public disclosure until after operational control transfers completely. How long? 3 or 4 days, Heather thought for a moment. That overlaps with the reunion. It does. Benjamin watched her expression carefully. If you prefer, we can accelerate the announcement. Heather slowly shook her head. No. You understand, there could be confusion. I do. Some people may misunderstand why you're there. Heather smiled gently. I'll survive misunderstanding. Benjamin returned the smile. That sounds exactly like your father. Silence settled across the room. Mentioning William Thompson still carried quiet weight even years after his passing. Heather glanced through the conference room windows overlooking downtown Denver. Her father had often stood in exactly the same place. He had built one of the country's most respected private real estate investment groups without seeking magazine covers or television interviews. Whenever reporters requested interviews, he usually declined. Buildings should make headlines, he once said. Owners shouldn't. Heather inherited more than his assets. She inherited his philosophy. Benjamin opened another folder. There are operational recommendations requiring your approval. Heather reviewed them one by one. Several executives proposed reducing housekeeping staff to improve quarterly profits. Heather immediately crossed out the recommendation. No layoffs. Benjamin made a note. The labor costs are higher than competitors. So is employee retention. She continued reading. Another proposal suggested replacing locally sourced food suppliers with national distributors. Heather shook her head again. The local partnerships stay. The profit margin will recover through guest loyalty. Benjamin wrote another note. He never argued with Heather when she had already examined the numbers. She based decisions on long-term value rather than quarterly appearances. That approach had consistently outperformed more aggressive investors. An hour later, the meeting concluded. Benjamin closed the final folder. I'll notify Olivia Bennett. Heather nodded. Olivia Bennett had managed the resort for 6 years. By every performance measure, she had done an exceptional job, despite limited financial support from the previous ownership group. Heather intended to keep her exactly where she was. Tell Olivia I'd like to meet privately when I arrive. I already scheduled it. Heather smiled. I assumed you had. Benjamin laughed quietly. I've known you long enough. Before leaving, Heather paused beside the doorway. One more thing. Benjamin waited. No special treatment during the reunion. You'll still technically own the property. I know. I'd rather experience the resort exactly as every guest does. Benjamin considered the request. I'll inform Olivia. Thank you. Meanwhile, across the city, Mark's priorities looked very different. He stood before a mirror inside an upscale men's clothing store while a tailor adjusted the sleeve of a custom navy dinner jacket. "What do you think?" the tailor asked. Mark admired his reflection. "It needs to look successful." The tailor smiled politely. "It certainly does." Mark purchased matching shoes, a silk tie, and an expensive watch he had not originally planned to buy. As he completed the transaction, he imagined Jason Miller noticing the watch first. Perhaps Amanda Collins would ask about his newest consulting contracts. Maybe Ethan Brooks would finally admit Mark had surpassed everyone's expectations. The reunion had gradually become less about reconnecting. It had become a performance. That evening, garment bags hung neatly inside the bedroom closet. Heather quietly packed one elegant dark green evening gown she had owned for years. It fit perfectly. She saw no reason to replace it. Mark noticed immediately. "You're wearing that?" Heather looked up. "It's appropriate. You should get something newer. I like this one. It doesn't exactly stand out." Heather folded the dress carefully before placing it into her suitcase. "I've never wanted my clothes to be the most interesting thing about me." Mark chuckled. "You always say things like that." She smiled softly. "And you always notice my clothes." He laughed again, assuming she was joking. Heather said nothing more. Later that night, after Mark had fallen asleep, she sat alone in her study. Her notebook rested open beneath a warm reading lamp. She wrote only 2 sentences. "The resort now belongs to our family. I hope the reunion still belongs to our memories." She closed the notebook and turned off the light. Neither she nor Mark realized that within days, those 2 worlds, business and memory, would collide in ways neither of them could control. Friday afternoon arrived beneath a clear Colorado sky, the kind that made the distant mountains appear close enough to touch. Mark Reynolds insisted on driving. He believed road trips always set the right tone for important weekends, though most of the 3-hour journey consisted of him talking about people Heather had not seen since graduation. "I heard Jason Miller sold his software company for almost $80 million. Heather looked out the passenger window as rolling hills replaced the Denver suburbs. "I read something about that. And Amanda Collins anchors the evening news now. I'm happy for her. Ethan Brooks became chief of surgery at St. Andrew S. He worked hard for that." Mark glanced briefly toward Heather before returning his eyes to the highway. "You don't seem excited." "I am. You don't sound like it." Heather smiled faintly. "I don't think excitement always has to be loud." Mark laughed. "You've always been impossible to read." Heather did not answer. Some people mistook silence for mystery. For Heather, silence was simply where careful thinking happened. The GPS announced they were 20 minutes away. Traffic gradually slowed as luxury vehicles filled the winding road leading toward Lake Evergreen Resort. The property appeared slowly through towering pine trees. Stone entrance pillars framed an elegant iron gate. Flower gardens stretched along the curved driveway. Beyond them stood the main lodge, built from timber and natural stone, overlooking a lake that reflected the afternoon sun like polished glass. Mark let out a low whistle. "Now this is impressive." Heather quietly studied the buildings. They looked exactly as she remembered from her final inspection several weeks earlier. Perhaps even better. Fresh landscaping surrounded the entrance. Outdoor seating areas had been rearranged. Seasonal flowers brightened the walkways. Someone had clearly prepared the property carefully for the reunion weekend. She suspected Olivia Bennett. As the car approached the front entrance, uniformed valets stepped forward. Mark handed over the keys with effortless confidence. Take good care of her. The valet smiled. Absolutely, sir. Heather thanked him softly before walking toward the lobby beside her husband. Inside, polished hardwood floors reflected warm afternoon light pouring through enormous windows overlooking the lake. A grand stone fireplace dominated one side of the lobby. Fresh flowers decorated every reception desk. Soft piano music drifted through hidden speakers. The atmosphere felt elegant without becoming extravagant. Exactly what Heather had hoped the resort would continue to represent. Behind the reception counter stood Olivia Bennett. Tall, composed, and impeccably professional, Olivia had managed luxury hospitality properties for nearly 20 years. She looked up as new guests entered. The moment her eyes met Heather's, recognition appeared, only for an instant. Then it disappeared beneath flawless professionalism. Olivia stepped forward. "Good afternoon. Welcome to Lake Evergreen Resort." Mark smiled. "Reservation under Reynolds." Olivia checked the computer screen. "Of course, Mr. Reynolds." As she completed the formalities, her attention briefly returned to Heather. Almost imperceptibly, Olivia inclined her head with the respectful acknowledgement normally reserved for owners and board members. Heather responded with the slightest movement of her eyes. Not now. Olivia understood immediately. No additional gesture followed. She simply handed Mark 2 room key cards. "Your Lakeview suite is ready." "Excellent. We hope you enjoy your stay." Mark accepted the cards without noticing anything unusual. Heather thanked Olivia quietly. "Everything looks wonderful." Olivia answered with careful professionalism. "We've worked very hard preparing for this weekend." "I can see that." Their conversation lasted only seconds. Yet both women understood far more than anyone standing nearby. As Mark and Heather walked toward the elevators, Olivia discreetly pressed a button beneath the reception desk. Within moments, an internal message appeared on several management devices throughout the property. "Owner has arrived. Maintain confidentiality according to legal agreement. Treat all guests equally. No employee is authorized to discuss ownership transition." The instructions spread quickly through department managers, housekeeping supervisors, restaurant directors, security personnel, executive assistants. Every senior employee had already signed confidentiality agreements earlier that week. Nobody intended to violate them. Inside the elevator, Mark admired the lobby through the glass walls. This place must be worth a fortune. Heather looked toward the lake beyond the windows. "It probably is. I wonder who owns it." Heather smiled, almost invisibly. "I imagine someone who saw potential." Their suite occupied the 3rd floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the lake. A stone balcony extended toward the water. Luxury furnishings combined modern comfort with rustic mountain architecture. Mark walked directly to the balcony. This reunion committee really outdid themselves. Heather slowly unpacked her suitcase. Everything appeared exactly as described in the investment reports. Yet, reading documents and experiencing a place personally remained completely different. She noticed tiny details. Fresh flowers arranged by local florists, artwork created by Colorado painters, handcrafted wooden furniture produced by nearby workshops. The previous ownership had preserved local character instead of replacing it with generic luxury. That decision alone had influenced Heather's investment. Communities deserved businesses that strengthened local identity, not erased it. Her phone vibrated quietly. A message from Benjamin Carter. "Olivia is available whenever convenient," Heather replied. "Tomorrow morning, private meeting only." Benjamin answered almost immediately. "Understood." Mark turned from the balcony. "I'm heading downstairs." "Already?" "People are arriving. Heather nodded. I'll join you in a little while. He adjusted his jacket. Try not to disappear into a book. She smiled. I'll do my best. After he left, Heather stood alone beside the window. The lake stretched peacefully beneath the afternoon sun. Everything looked calm, yet she knew ownership carried invisible responsibilities few guests ever considered. Employee livelihoods, maintenance budgets, insurance policies, environmental regulations, community partnerships. Every beautiful view depended upon countless unseen decisions. She hoped to make good ones. 45 minutes later, Heather entered the reunion welcome reception. Clusters of former classmates filled the ballroom. Some recognized one another immediately. Others stared at name badges before laughter broke years of distance. Mark already stood near the center of the room. Jason Miller clapped him on the shoulder. Mark, I can't believe it's been 15 years. Jason. Nearby stood Ethan Brooks, still calm, still observant. His physician's posture remained unmistakable. Amanda Collins joined them moments later. Television had made her face familiar far beyond campus. More classmates gathered. Ryan Cooper, Nicole Parker, Lauren Evans. Conversations blended into cheerful noise. Mark spotted Heather approaching. There she is. Jason smiled politely. Heather Thompson, good to see you again. You too. Amanda embraced Heather briefly. You haven't changed. Heather laughed softly. I think the mirror disagrees. Everyone smiled. At first, the atmosphere felt genuinely warm. Old stories resurfaced. Embarrassing college memories returned. Professors' names prompted laughter. Then, subtle comparisons began. Jason discussed acquisitions. Amanda mentioned national broadcasting. Ryan described expanding his engineering firm. Someone asked Mark about consulting. His confidence immediately intensified. Business achievements filled the conversation. Revenue growth, corporate clients, luxury travel, executive leadership. Heather quietly listened. Lauren eventually turned toward her. What about you, Heather? I manage investments. What kind? Mostly long-term real estate. Mark answered before Heather could continue. She keeps things pretty simple. His tone sounded casual, almost playful. Heather glanced toward him. She recognized that familiar habit, speaking for her. It had become increasingly common over the years. Lauren smiled politely. I'm sure there's more to it than that. Heather answered gently. I enjoy the work. The conversation shifted elsewhere. Nobody pressed further. Across the ballroom, Olivia Bennett observed discreetly from a distance while greeting guests and coordinating staff. She noticed every interaction, every expression, every careless word. Professional experience had taught her that people often revealed themselves most clearly when surrounded by old memories. As evening approached, employees prepared the grand dining hall for the formal reunion dinner. Round tables gleamed beneath crystal chandeliers. Place cards waited beside polished silverware. Soft music echoed through the elegant room. Outside, sunset painted the lake in shades of gold and crimson. Inside, anticipation quietly gathered. Heather stood near the windows, watching the fading light. Mark laughed loudly behind her as another classmate praised his career. She closed her notebook after writing only one sentence. Beautiful places cannot protect people from ugly choices. Within an hour, everyone would take their seats for dinner. Before the desserts were served, the reunion would become unforgettable for reasons no one had expected, especially Mark Reynolds. By 7 o'clock, every seat in the grand dining hall had been filled. The reunion committee had arranged the tables in wide circles, rather than long rows, hoping to encourage conversation among former classmates. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light across polished silverware, while floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Lake Evergreen, now glowing beneath the last traces of sunset. Soft jazz drifted through hidden speakers. Servers moved quietly between tables, placing fresh bread wine glasses and carefully prepared appetizers before each guest. It should have been an evening dedicated to memories. Instead, it slowly became something else. Heather Thompson sat beside Mark Reynolds, with the same calm posture she had maintained throughout the afternoon. Her dark green evening gown was elegant without attracting unnecessary attention. She wore no extravagant jewelry beyond the simple platinum wedding band that still rested on her finger. Across the table, Amanda Collins admired the view. "I forgot how beautiful Colorado can be." Jason Miller nodded. "I've attended conferences in resorts all over the country." He glanced around the room. "This place is among the best I've seen." "It really is," Ethan Brooks agreed. "Whoever owns it clearly understands hospitality." Heather quietly lifted her water glass. She said nothing. Mark smiled confidently. "I imagine someone with very deep pockets." Everyone laughed lightly. The conversation moved naturally through careers, families, children vacations, and old professors, whose impossible exams had once united the entire graduating class. For a while, the atmosphere remained comfortable. Heather even found herself laughing when Ryan Cooper retold the story of a disastrous freshman camping trip that had ended with half the students lost in the mountains until sunrise. Those memories felt genuine, uncomplicated. They reminded her of people before titles became introductions. Eventually, the reunion committee invited volunteers to share what life had brought them during the past 15 years. The microphone circulated from table to table. Some stories were inspiring, others were humorous. One classmate described opening a bakery after leaving corporate law. Another spoke about raising 3 children while completing medical school. The room applauded every speaker, not because every story involved extraordinary success, because every story represented a different path. Heather appreciated that. Then the microphone reached Mark. He stood smoothly, adjusted his dinner jacket, and accepted polite applause. 15 years, he began with an easy smile. "It hardly feels possible." Several classmates nodded. Mark spoke confidently about building Reynolds Strategic Consulting from a small office into a respected advisory firm. He described difficult early years, late nights, financial uncertainty, winning major clients, expanding into multiple states. The audience listened with interest. Everything he said was true. Heather never questioned his accomplishments. He had worked relentlessly. He deserved recognition for that effort. Then Amanda smiled. "You've done incredibly well." Mark laughed modestly. "I've been fortunate." Jason raised his glass. "And you've got a supportive wife beside you." Mark looked toward Heather. For a brief moment, Heather thought he might simply thank her. Instead, a different expression crossed his face. A playful grin, the kind she had seen growing more often over recent years. "Oh, Heather," he chuckled. "She's been my greatest exercise in patience." Scattered laughter floated around the table. Heather remained still. Mark continued. "Whenever business gets complicated, I always know I can come home and explain absolutely nothing." A few people laughed again. Amanda smiled politely. Jason grinned. Heather quietly folded her hands together beneath the table. Mark leaned comfortably against his chair. "You know how some couples discuss mergers and investment strategies over dinner?" He shrugged dramatically. "My wife usually asks whether I remembered to buy coffee." Several louder laughs followed. Not everyone joined them. Ethan lowered his eyes toward his plate. Lauren Evans glanced briefly at Heather before looking away. Ryan forced a smile that disappeared almost immediately. Heather's expression never changed. Mark seemed encouraged by the reaction. "You have to understand." He pointed playfully toward Heather. "Finance isn't exactly her world." Heather looked at him calmly. He knew that statement wasn't true. Or perhaps he had simply forgotten. She had spent years analyzing investment portfolios before he even launched his consulting company. She had once reviewed several of his earliest business plans line by line. Mark either no longer remembered or no longer cared. Amanda attempted to redirect the conversation. "I'm sure every successful marriage works differently." "It does," Mark replied. "In ours, I earn the exciting stories." More laughter. Heather noticed something interesting. The laughter had changed. At first it sounded spontaneous. Now it felt uncertain. People laughed because others had laughed before them. Not because the joke itself remained amusing. The distinction mattered. Jason took another sip of wine. "So what do you do these days, Heather?" Before she could answer, Mark spoke again. "She manages some investment paperwork." Heather slowly turned toward him. He smiled as though he were doing her a favor. "Nothing glamorous." Heather answered quietly. "I oversee long-term real estate investments." Jason nodded. "That sounds interesting." Mark laughed. "It sounds more exciting than it actually is." Amanda looked uncomfortable. Heather always was good with numbers. Mark waved dismissively. "Oh, she's organized." He raised his glass again. "But let's be honest." His voice grew just loud enough for neighboring tables to hear. "The only luxury property she'll ever control is deciding which hotel room we're staying in." Several nearby guests turned toward their table. Someone chuckled. Someone else looked down at the tablecloth. Heather felt dozens of eyes settling upon her. The ballroom suddenly seemed quieter. Not silent, but quieter. She could hear silverware touching porcelain plates across the room. She could hear the piano from the lobby drifting faintly through the open doors. Most clearly of all, she could hear Mark's confidence growing. He mistook attention for approval. Heather gently lifted her wine glass. She took a slow sip before placing it back on the table. No shaking hands, no angry expression, no visible embarrassment, only stillness. Lauren leaned toward her. "You don't have to listen to this." Heather offered a small smile. "I'm listening." Lauren studied her face. "You're not upset," Heather answered honestly. "I'm paying attention." Those 3 words carried more weight than Lauren realized. Across the room, Olivia Bennett had paused near the entrance while reviewing service with the banquet manager. She had heard enough of Mark's remarks to understand the direction of the evening. Several employees exchanged uncomfortable glances. One young server whispered softly, "Does he know?" Olivia answered without taking her eyes from the dining room. "No." "Should someone stop this?" Olivia shook her head once. "Our responsibility is to serve every guest professionally." "But the owner has given very clear instructions." The young employee immediately nodded. Olivia silently admired Heather's composure. Most people placed in that situation would have walked out. Some would have argued. Others might have humiliated Mark immediately by revealing the truth. Heather did none of those things. She simply observed, exactly as she had during every meeting Olivia had attended over the previous month. Back inside the ballroom, dessert arrived. The atmosphere attempted to recover. Conversations resumed. People discussed children leaving for college, vacation plans, retirement. Yet an invisible tension remained. Everyone remembered what had happened. Even those who had laughed earlier now seemed uncertain. Ethan finally spoke. "Mark." Mark looked over. "You've had an impressive career." "Thank you. But success usually sounds better when the people closest to us don't become part of the punchline." The table fell completely silent. Mark laughed awkwardly. "Oh, come on. Heather knows I'm joking." Every eye turned toward Heather. She looked at Ethan first, then at Mark. Finally, she answered in the same calm voice she had used all evening. "People often mean more than they realize when they repeat the same joke." No accusation, no anger, simply an observation. Mark forced another smile. "You always were philosophical." Heather did not respond. Instead, she quietly opened the small notebook she carried in her evening bag. She wrote a single sentence. Not because she intended to use it against anyone, only because she never wanted memory to rewrite what had truly happened. She closed the notebook. Across the ballroom, Olivia received a discreet text message from Benjamin Carter. "Closing documents recorded with the state at 6:42 p.m. Ownership legally finalized. Public announcement authorized tomorrow after 10:00 a.m. Olivia read the message once, then locked her phone. Tomorrow morning. Less than 15 hours remained before every legal barrier protecting Heather's identity would disappear. Tonight, however, the reunion continued exactly as Mark believed it would. He still thought he controlled the room. He still believed the evening belonged to him. He had no idea that the very building surrounding him already belonged to the woman he had spent the last hour diminishing before friends, classmates, employees, and strangers alike. And the law had just ensured that nothing, not denial, not excuses, not apologies, could change that. Heather slept lightly. Long before sunrise, she opened her eyes to the pale blue light filtering through the curtains of the Lakeview suite. The resort remained almost perfectly silent. Only the distant sound of birds and the gentle movement of water against the shoreline reached the balcony. She sat upright without waking Mark. For several moments, she simply watched him. His face looked younger while he slept, peaceful, very different from the confident, performative version of himself that had entertained classmates the previous evening. Heather remembered another morning nearly 16 years earlier. Back then, they had shared a tiny apartment with worn carpet, mismatched furniture, and a refrigerator that hummed loudly enough to wake them before sunrise. Mark had apologized countless times for not being able to afford better. Heather had laughed, wrapped both hands around a cheap mug of coffee, and told him the apartment was only temporary. "We're building a life," she had said, "not decorating one." He had kissed her forehead. I'll never forget that. The memory lingered painfully now. Not because Heather wished to return to those difficult years, but because promises spoken with complete sincerity sometimes disappeared without either person noticing exactly when. She quietly dressed in a cream-colored blouse, navy slacks, and a lightweight blazer. Nothing about her appearance suggested the owner of a luxury mountain resort. That was intentional. She slipped the familiar leather notebook into her handbag before stepping onto the balcony. The lake reflected the first rays of sunlight. Employees had already begun preparing outdoor seating areas for breakfast. Gardeners watered flower beds. Maintenance staff inspected walking paths. Kitchen deliveries arrived through a side entrance. The property felt alive long before guests woke. Heather admired that rhythm. A successful resort depended less upon elegant architecture than upon hundreds of ordinary people performing ordinary responsibilities exceptionally well. At 7 o'clock, Mark stirred awake. He stretched lazily before noticing Heather standing near the window. "You're up early?" "I couldn't sleep." He smiled. "Still thinking about last night?" Heather looked toward him. "I've been thinking." Mark sat on the edge of the bed. "I hope you didn't take the joke seriously." She answered after a brief pause. "Did you?" He frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "You told them I didn't understand business. It was just conversation. You also said I'd never control a luxury property." Mark laughed. "Come on, Heather. You know everyone was laughing." She nodded. "I noticed." He walked over and lightly kissed her cheek. "You've always been too sensitive about these things." Heather almost corrected him. She wasn't hurt because people had laughed. She was disappointed because Mark believed public embarrassment strengthened his image. But she chose not to continue the discussion. Some conversations produced answers only after experience spoke louder than words. "I'm going downstairs for breakfast," Mark said. "You coming?" "I have a meeting first." He looked surprised. A meeting? Just something related to investments. "Even on vacation?" She smiled gently. "Some responsibilities don't pause." Mark shrugged. "Don't be gone too long." "I won't." After he left, Heather waited another 15 minutes before taking the private elevator leading toward the executive offices. Unlike the guest elevators, this entrance remained hidden behind a discreet hallway near the conference wing. A security employee standing nearby immediately recognized her. "Good morning, Miss Thompson." "Good morning. Miss Bennett is waiting." Heather thanked him and continued inside. Olivia Bennett stood near a conference table covered with architectural drawings, financial reports, and renovation schedules. Benjamin Carter was already reviewing several legal documents. Both stood as Heather entered. "Good morning," Olivia said warmly. "Good morning." Benjamin smiled. "I trust you slept better than I did." Heather raised an eyebrow. "Legal paperwork, and worrying that someone would accidentally reveal your identity before today." Heather laughed softly. "I'm glad they didn't." Olivia gestured toward a chair. "We've prepared everything." The meeting began promptly. Olivia reviewed occupancy reports first. 96% full this weekend. Heather nodded. "Excellent. Guest satisfaction scores remain among the highest in the region." Benjamin added, "The acquisition has generated no operational disruption, exactly as planned." Heather appreciated careful transitions. Guests should never experience uncertainty simply because ownership changed. Olivia moved to staffing reports. "We currently employ 214 full-time workers and 86 seasonal employees." Heather studied the numbers. "I saw the proposal recommending layoffs." Olivia sighed. "That came from the previous ownership group. They wanted immediate savings." Heather closed the file. "We're not reducing staff." Olivia smiled with obvious relief. "I was hoping you'd say that. Our service depends upon people." "Exactly." Benjamin made another note for the official minutes. Heather continued reading. The next report addressed deferred maintenance. Several guest cabins required roof repairs. Walking trails needed restoration. Kitchen equipment in one restaurant approached the end of its service life. Previous owners had postponed improvements to increase short-term profits before selling. Heather marked each project. "Approve them." Olivia looked up. "All of them?" "Yes. The budget is significant. So is protecting the property's future." Benjamin glanced toward Olivia. "I told you." Olivia smiled knowingly. "You did." Heather continued. "What about employee housing?" Olivia hesitated. "Several buildings need renovation." "Then add them." "They aren't revenue generating." Heather looked directly at her. "Employees who feel respected create guests who return. For a moment, nobody spoke. Olivia finally nodded. I couldn't agree more. The discussion shifted toward community partnerships. Local farms supplied produce. Regional artists displayed work throughout the resort. Nearby craftsmen produced custom furniture. Heather approved expanding every partnership. My father believed successful businesses should strengthen their communities. Olivia smiled. I've heard that about him. He was right. Benjamin checked his watch. One final matter. He placed a sealed envelope on the table. The state officially recorded ownership last night. Heather opened it carefully. Inside rested the final certification confirming Thompson Legacy Holdings as the legal owner of Lake Evergreen Resort. Every signature, every seal, every filing number. Complete. Benjamin spoke quietly. As of this morning, there are no remaining legal restrictions. Heather nodded. When will the executive team be informed? 10 o'clock. And the board? Immediately afterward. Olivia asked, what about the reunion guests? Heather considered the question carefully. There doesn't need to be a public announcement. Benjamin looked surprised. You don't want one? No. They'll eventually find out. They will. But I don't want anyone embarrassed simply because they underestimated me. Olivia exchanged a brief glance with Benjamin. Neither seemed entirely surprised. That answer reflected everything they had learned about Heather during months of negotiations. She invested to build, not to dominate. Benjamin closed his folder. There is one complication. Heather waited. Mark has requested a presentation this afternoon. Heather looked puzzled. A presentation? He wants Reynolds Strategic Consulting considered for future development projects. Olivia added, he submitted the request several weeks before the acquisition. Heather thought quietly. Has the agenda already been approved? Yes. Then leave it unchanged. Benjamin watched her carefully. You'll be chairing the meeting. I understand. He doesn't know. I know. Olivia hesitated. Would you prefer another executive handle it? Heather slowly shook her head. No. Are you sure? The company deserves a fair evaluation. Benjamin leaned back thoughtfully. And Mark? He deserves exactly the same process every applicant receives. No more, no less. Meanwhile, several floors above Mark enjoyed breakfast with Jason Miller and Ryan Cooper on the outdoor terrace. Sunlight sparkled across the lake. Coffee cups filled the table. Conversation quickly returned to business. Jason smiled. I've got a lunch meeting with one of the resort executives. Mark looked interested. Really? Thinking about a possible investment partnership. Mark leaned forward. Funny enough, I requested a meeting myself. Ryan laughed. Look at us. We can't even attend a reunion without talking business. Mark grinned. Opportunities don't take vacations. Jason nodded approvingly. You've always had drive. Mark accepted the compliment easily. I've learned to recognize valuable properties. He glanced proudly across the resort grounds. This place has incredible potential. Back inside the executive offices, Heather stood near the same windows overlooking the lake. She watched guests enjoying breakfast, completely unaware of the ownership transition quietly unfolding behind closed doors. In a few short hours, legal documents would replace assumptions. Professional procedures would replace appearances. No raised voices, no dramatic confrontation, only signatures, records, and facts. Exactly the way her father had always believed important truths should emerge. Heather closed her notebook after writing one final sentence before leaving the conference room. The law never needs to shout to be heard. She slipped the notebook into her handbag. At 2 o'clock that afternoon, Mark Reynolds would walk into an executive presentation believing he was meeting potential business partners. He had no idea he was about to present his company's future to the very woman he had publicly dismissed less than 12 hours earlier. The executive offices became noticeably busier after 10 o'clock. Department heads arrived carrying reports tablets and presentation folders. Some had worked at Lake Evergreen Resort for more than a decade. Others had joined only recently, attracted by the property's reputation for exceptional guest service, despite years of inconsistent ownership. This morning marked the beginning of a different chapter. Olivia Bennett stood at the head of the conference room. "Thank you all for coming on short notice." The conversations faded. She continued calmly. "As of last night, the ownership transition has been completed. Before introducing our new owner, I want to thank every one of you for maintaining complete professionalism throughout this confidential process." Several managers nodded. Only a handful had known the buyer's identity. Most expected a large investment corporation from New York or Chicago. Olivia turned toward the doorway. Heather Thompson entered without ceremony. She wore the same navy blazer from earlier that morning, carrying only her leather notebook and a slim folder. No expensive jewelry, no dramatic entrance, no assistants following behind her. For a brief second, complete silence filled the room. Several department heads recognized her immediately. She had walked through the property the previous afternoon like an ordinary guest. Others looked confused. Olivia smiled. "I'd like everyone to meet Miss Heather Thompson, owner of Lake Evergreen Resort through Thompson Legacy Holdings." The silence lasted another heartbeat before everyone stood almost instinctively. Heather immediately raised one hand. "Please." The room paused. "Sit down." The managers slowly returned to their seats. Heather walked to the front of the room. "Thank you." Her voice remained soft enough that everyone leaned forward to listen. "I know ownership changes often create uncertainty." She looked around the table, making eye contact with each department head instead of speaking only to Olivia. "I'd like to remove some of that uncertainty immediately." Several employees straightened in their chairs. "No layoffs are planned." A few shoulders visibly relaxed. "I've reviewed proposals recommending staff reductions." She closed the folder in front of her. "I rejected them." Across the table, the Human Resources Director quietly exhaled. Heather continued. "Excellent hospitality isn't created by cutting experienced people." Several department heads exchanged appreciative glances. "The guests returned because of you. Not because of ownership, not because of marketing, because of people." She allowed the words to settle before continuing. "Every employee who works honestly deserves stability whenever possible." The maintenance director, an older man named Charles Donovan, raised a cautious hand. "What about the renovation budget?" Heather smiled. "We're approving the postponed repairs." Charles blinked. "All of them?" "Yes." "The roof replacements?" "Approved." "The cabin renovations?" "Approved." "The employee housing improvements?" Heather nodded. "Also approved." The room grew noticeably quieter. Many had expected new ownership to arrive demanding immediate savings. Instead, Heather discussed long-term investment. Olivia watched the employees carefully. Hope spread across faces that had entered the meeting expecting uncertainty. Heather opened another report. "I'd also like quarterly meetings with department representatives." The food and beverage director looked surprised. "Department representatives?" "I want feedback directly from employees." Olivia smiled. "You'll probably receive more honest answers that way." "I hope so." Heather believed executives often spent too much time listening only to other executives. The people cleaning guest rooms usually understood operational problems long before board members ever saw them. Benjamin Carter entered quietly, carrying several legal binders. He placed them beside Heather. The ownership certificates for department records. Heather thanked him. Benjamin addressed the group. All regulatory filings have been completed. Operational authority transfers immediately. Everything now existed beyond rumor. Every signature, every filing, every certification, properly recorded, exactly as the law required. Heather concluded the meeting with only one additional request. I have no interest in changing the culture that already makes this resort special. She glanced toward Olivia. I simply want to give talented people the resources they deserve. When the meeting ended, employees remained standing long after Heather left the room. Several quietly applauded. Not because she had promised impossible things, because she had listened before speaking. Meanwhile, Mark Reynolds spent the late morning exactly where he expected successful reunion attendees to spend it. The networking lounge. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the lake while executives, entrepreneurs, physicians, attorneys, and consultants exchanged business cards over coffee. Mark moved comfortably between conversations. He enjoyed environments where professional accomplishments became social currency. Jason Miller introduced him to a venture capitalist from Seattle. Amanda Collins introduced him to a regional television executive. Ryan Cooper mentioned a possible infrastructure project requiring consulting services. Everything seemed to reinforce Mark's belief that the weekend was unfolding perfectly. Heather crossed the lobby once during the morning after finishing the executive meeting. She carried only her notebook. Mark noticed her. There you are. Heather approached. How's networking going? Great. He smiled confidently. I've already made 3 valuable connections. I'm glad. Jason looked toward Heather. Have you been relaxing? Heather answered honestly. I had a business meeting. Mark laughed. She never really takes vacations. Jason smiled politely. What kind of business? Before Heather could answer, Mark spoke. Investment paperwork. Heather looked toward him. He didn't notice. Ryan changed the subject before the conversation became awkward. Lunch starts in 15 minutes. Everyone began walking toward the terrace restaurant. As they passed through the lobby, Olivia Bennett happened to be speaking with 2 department directors. The moment she noticed Heather, Olivia instinctively stepped slightly aside. Not dramatically. Not enough for casual guests to recognize. Simply the respectful gesture she would naturally offer the owner. Heather acknowledged her with a faint smile before continuing. Mark never looked toward the reception desk. His attention remained fixed on describing an upcoming consulting proposal. Olivia watched them disappear toward the restaurant. Benjamin quietly approached from behind. He still doesn't know. Olivia shook her head. Not even close. Benjamin glanced toward the departing group. I almost feel sorry for him. Olivia considered that. I feel sorry for the version of him she remembers. Lunch passed pleasantly enough. No one repeated the previous night's jokes. Perhaps Ethan Brooks's quiet observation had changed the mood. Perhaps everyone sensed an invisible line had already been crossed. Mark remained charming, confident, articulate. Heather remained attentive, kind, reserved. After dessert, Mark checked his watch. I've got that presentation in 30 minutes. Jason smiled. The resort partnership? Exactly. Ryan raised his coffee cup. Good luck. Mark grinned. I've prepared for weeks. Heather quietly sipped iced tea. What time? 2. He stood. I should review my slides one last time. Heather nodded. I hope it goes well. Mark smiled. It will. He leaned down and briefly kissed her forehead. I'll see you afterward. As he walked away, Ethan happened to notice Heather watching him. You really hope it goes well. Heather turned toward him. I always hope people do their best. Ethan hesitated. Even after last night, she answered without bitterness. Professional decisions shouldn't depend on personal feelings. Ethan studied her expression for a moment. Then he smiled slightly. I remember you. Heather looked puzzled. From college. You were always the calmest person in the room before every exam. She laughed softly. I was terrified. You never looked terrified. My father taught me something. What? Heather folded her napkin carefully. Preparation often looks like confidence. Ethan nodded thoughtfully. I think that's true. Neither of them realized those words would describe the next hour perfectly. At 1:45, Mark entered the business center, carrying a leather portfolio containing presentation materials, financial projections, and partnership proposals. A receptionist greeted him warmly. Good afternoon, Mr. Reynolds. Oh, I'm here for the executive development meeting. She checked the schedule. Yes, sir. She handed him a visitor badge. The boardroom is at the end of the hallway. Mark thanked her. Walking confidently through the executive corridor, he admired framed photographs showing the resort's history. He straightened his tie before reaching the large wooden doors marked Executive Boardroom. He took one slow breath. This could become one of the biggest contracts of his career. Inside the room, Olivia Bennett arranged several folders around the conference table. Benjamin Carter reviewed legal documents one final time. An empty chair waited at the head of the table. Heather Thompson had not yet entered. Everything was ready. Everything was documented. Everything would proceed according to agenda. And within minutes, the assumptions Mark Reynolds had carried for years would begin colliding with facts that neither confidence nor charm could change. At precisely 2 o'clock, the boardroom doors opened. Mark Reynolds entered with the practiced confidence of someone accustomed to presenting before executives. He carried a leather portfolio beneath one arm and a tablet loaded with financial projections beneath the other. His expression reflected neither arrogance nor anxiety, only certainty. He believed preparation guaranteed results. Good afternoon, he said warmly. Olivia Bennett rose from her seat. Good afternoon, Mr. Reynolds. Thank you for coming. Mark shook her hand. My pleasure. Benjamin Carter nodded politely from across the room. Mr. Reynolds. Mark returned the greeting. The room itself reflected understated elegance rather than excess. A polished walnut conference table occupied the center. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Lake Evergreen, where small sailboats drifted peacefully across the afternoon water. Fresh coffee had been prepared beside neatly arranged glasses and legal pads. Nothing felt intimidating. Everything felt professional, exactly the sort of environment Mark enjoyed. He placed his portfolio on the table. I appreciate the opportunity. Olivia smiled. We appreciate your interest in working with the resort. Mark looked around. I assume we're waiting for the ownership representative. We are. He checked his watch. No problem. For several quiet moments, they discussed the consulting industry tourism trends and the challenges facing luxury hospitality businesses. Mark answered confidently. He spoke fluently about branding, operational efficiency, and long-term positioning. Benjamin listened without interruption. Occasionally, he wrote brief notes in the margin of a legal pad. Olivia observed something else entirely. Mark possessed genuine intelligence. His presentation skills were polished. His confidence felt natural inside a business setting. She found herself wondering how someone capable of speaking with such professionalism could sound so dismissive toward his own wife less than 24 hours earlier. The contradiction lingered in her mind. A discreet knock interrupted the conversation. Olivia looked toward the doorway. "Come in." The door opened. Heather Thompson stepped inside, carrying only her familiar leather notebook. She wore the same navy blazer from the morning meeting. No dramatic wardrobe change, no display of wealth, no entourage. Mark looked over his shoulder. "Oh," he smiled casually. "There you are." Heather returned the smile. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all." Mark turned back toward Olivia. "My wife had another investment meeting earlier today." He chuckled. "I think she enjoys meetings more than vacations." Olivia maintained perfect composure. "So I've noticed." Mark laughed. "You don't have to be polite." Heather quietly walked towards one of the chairs along the side of the room. Mark assumed she intended to wait until the presentation ended. That assumption lasted only a few seconds. Before Heather could sit down, Benjamin stood. "So we're all here?" Olivia nodded. "Yes." She looked toward Heather. "We're ready whenever you are." Mark glanced between them, slightly confused. Ready for what Heather remained standing. She set her notebook gently on the conference table. Instead of choosing a seat along the side, she walked toward the chair positioned at the very head of the table. Mark watched with mild curiosity. Perhaps someone had simply directed her to the wrong place. Before he could say anything, Olivia spoke. "Mr. Reynolds, before your presentation begins, there is one procedural matter we need to complete." "Of course." "As part of the ownership transition, introductions are required for all new strategic partners." Mark nodded. "Certainly." Olivia turned toward Heather. Her voice remained calm, formal, and unmistakably respectful. "Miss Thompson." Heather inclined her head slightly. Olivia continued. "On behalf of Lake Evergreen Resort, I'd like to formally welcome you to your first executive development meeting as owner and chair of today's review committee." Silence. Not dramatic silence, not theatrical silence. Simply the complete absence of sound. Mark stared at Olivia, then at Heather, then back again. A faint smile crossed his face. He assumed he had misunderstood. "I'm sorry." He laughed softly. "I don't think I heard that correctly." Benjamin opened a leather binder. "You heard correctly, Mr. Reynolds." Heather calmly took the chair at the head of the table. Not hurriedly, not triumphantly, simply because it was where the agenda required her to sit. Mark remained standing. His eyes stayed fixed on Heather. "What exactly is happening?" Benjamin slid a document across the polished table. "The ownership transfer concluded yesterday evening." Mark looked down. The first page displayed the official seal of the state of Colorado. Below it appeared the legal ownership registration. Lake Evergreen Resort. Owner Thompson Legacy Holdings. Authorized trustee Heather Marie Thompson. Benjamin spoke evenly. "The filing was officially recorded yesterday at 6:42 p.m. Mark did not touch the document. He continued staring at Heather. "This," he searched for words. "This has to be some kind of mistake." Heather answered quietly. "It isn't." Mark looked toward Olivia. "You knew?" "Yes." "When?" "For several weeks." He turned back toward Benjamin. "And you?" Benjamin nodded once. "I supervised the acquisition." Mark laughed again. This time the sound carried no confidence, only disbelief. "No." He shook his head. "No, that's impossible." Heather remained composed. Benjamin calmly opened another folder. "I expected questions." He removed several documents. The purchase agreement. Another. The banking confirmation. Another. The wire transfer receipt. Another. The deed transfer. Each document slid neatly across the conference table. Every page contained signatures, official seals, registration numbers, bank verification. Nothing emotional, nothing exaggerated, only facts. Mark finally picked up one page. His eyes moved quickly across the text. Purchase price, funding institution, closing date, authorized signatures. Everything matched. Everything appeared genuine. He looked toward Heather again. "You..." His voice faltered. "You bought the resort," Heather answered simply. "Yes." "When?" "The acquisition process began 8 months ago." 8 months. She nodded. "It closed yesterday." Mark blinked repeatedly. "You never said anything. You never asked." The sentence wasn't delivered as an accusation, only a statement. Mark opened his mouth, closed it again. For several long seconds, he seemed unable to organize his thoughts. Finally, he spoke. "Why would you keep something like this from me?" Heather folded her hands together. "I've never hidden that I manage investments. I thought..." He stopped. Heather finished the sentence for him. "You thought I handled paperwork." Mark remembered the previous evening. His own voice echoed painfully inside his memory. "She manages some investment paperwork, nothing glamorous. The only luxury property she'll ever control." The realization struck him with almost physical force. Every joke, every laugh, every careless sentence, spoken inside a building that legally belonged to Heather. Olivia broke the silence gently. "Mr. Reynolds." He looked up. "Today's meeting concerns your consulting proposal." Mark stared at her. "My proposal?" "Yes. The agenda remains unchanged." Benjamin added calmly. "All applicants receive identical review procedures." Mark looked at Heather. She met his eyes without anger, without satisfaction, without triumph, professional, steady, exactly as she had been throughout the entire weekend. "You still want to hear the presentation?" Heather answered without hesitation. "Of course." After... He glanced helplessly around the room. "After everything." "This meeting isn't about our marriage." Her voice remained remarkably calm. "It's about whether your company is the right partner for this property." Mark slowly lowered himself into his chair. He no longer looked like the confident consultant who had entered 15 minutes earlier. He looked like someone attempting to rebuild his understanding of reality one piece at a time. Benjamin quietly adjusted the agenda. "Whenever you're ready." Mark stared at his presentation remote. His hands had become noticeably unsteady. For the first time in many years, he wasn't worried about impressing the people sitting across from him. He was trying to understand how he had failed to recognize the woman sitting at the head of the table. Heather opened her notebook. She wrote today's date. Nothing else. Not yet. Because despite everything that had happened, she intended to judge only the proposal in front of her, not the man who had humiliated her the night before. That distinction would become the most important decision either of them made that afternoon. For several long seconds, no one moved. The silence inside the executive boardroom no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt inevitable. Mark Reynolds remained seated with both hands resting on the edge of the conference table. His presentation remote lay untouched beside his portfolio. Only 15 minutes earlier, he had entered, believing he understood every person in the room. Now he questioned nearly everything. Heather Thompson sat at the head of the table exactly as she had during the morning executive meeting. The legal documents remained neatly organized beside her notebook. She neither pushed them toward Mark nor withdrew them from sight. They no longer needed emphasis. The facts already existed. Benjamin Carter quietly closed one of the binders. "Mr. Reynolds," he said evenly, "would you like a few minutes before we begin?" Mark looked toward him. "A few minutes? If you need time." Mark inhaled slowly. "No." He straightened in his chair. "I requested this meeting." His voice remained controlled, though noticeably quieter than before. "I'll continue." Heather looked at him without expression. "Take whatever time you need." He nodded once. Then he opened his portfolio. The familiar routine helped steady his thoughts. Laptop, presentation remote, printed executive summary, financial projections. For years, Mark had built his professional reputation on remaining composed under pressure. He desperately needed that skill now. The large monitor at the end of the conference room illuminated. The first slide appeared. Reynolds Strategic Consulting, strategic growth through premium hospitality partnerships. Mark began speaking. Normally, his presentations flowed effortlessly. Today, each sentence required deliberate concentration. "Our firm specializes in operational expansion for luxury properties." He clicked to the next slide. "We focus primarily on revenue optimization." His voice hesitated almost imperceptibly. "Through diversified guest experiences." Benjamin continued taking notes. Olivia reviewed the printed proposal. Heather listened without interruption. No one mentioned the previous evening. No one referred again to the ownership revelation. Business came first, exactly as Heather intended. Gradually, Mark found a more comfortable rhythm. He described marketing initiatives, corporate retreat programs, conference partnerships, seasonal pricing strategies, guest loyalty incentives. Some recommendations demonstrated genuine insight. Others reflected assumptions that overlooked the unique character of Lake Evergreen Resort. Heather quietly underlined several passages inside the proposal. She wrote brief observations beside them. Not criticisms, questions. Mark reached the financial projections. "Our analysis estimates a 22% increase in annual revenue within 3 years. Heather finally spoke. "May I ask how you calculated occupancy growth?" Mark welcomed the question. It felt familiar, professional. He opened another spreadsheet. "We compared similar luxury resorts in neighboring states." Heather studied the chart. "I noticed you included Aspen Highlands." "Yes." "And Silver Pines." "Correct." She looked up. Neither property serves the same guest demographic. Mark paused. "Their room rates are comparable." "They are." Heather nodded. "But Aspen Highlands relies primarily on winter tourism." She pointed gently toward another chart. "Lake Evergreen operates year-round." Mark looked back at the figures. She was right. Heather continued. "Silver Pines also receives nearly 40% of its revenue from international travel. Our international numbers are much lower." Mark slowly adjusted the spreadsheet. "I didn't have access to your internal reports." Benjamin spoke calmly. "The public reports contain that information." Mark looked surprised. "They do." Benjamin nodded. "Appendix C." Mark opened the printed materials. Within seconds, he found the section. He had overlooked it. A small mistake, but a real one. He corrected the slide. "Thank you." Heather simply nodded. "Please continue." There was no embarrassment in her tone, only accuracy. The meeting moved forward. Mark presented renovation partnerships, corporate event strategies, technology upgrades, employee productivity recommendations. Then he reached one particular slide. operational cost reduction. Olivia's expression changed immediately. Mark spoke confidently. Our first recommendation involves reducing housekeeping staff through outsourced scheduling. Heather remained silent. He continued. Approximately 12% labor savings during the first fiscal year. Benjamin quietly placed a copy of the proposal beside Heather. She already had one. Still, he anticipated the discussion that would follow. Mark clicked to another slide. Additional savings become possible through centralized purchasing. He looked toward Heather. Combined, these measures significantly improve profitability. Heather folded her hands. May I ask another question? Of course. You visited the property yesterday? Yes. And today? Correct. How many housekeepers did you speak with? Mark blinked. I didn't. Any maintenance employees? No. Kitchen staff? No. Heather nodded thoughtfully. Front desk supervisors? Mark hesitated. No. She looked down briefly at her notes, then back toward him. How did you evaluate operational efficiency without speaking to the people performing the work? The question lingered. Mark searched for an answer. We analyzed industry benchmarks. Heather acknowledged that. Benchmarks are useful. She paused. But they rarely replace first-hand observation. Olivia watched quietly. Heather's tone never became confrontational. She simply continued asking questions. What percentage of returning guests request specific housekeeping staff by name? Mark admitted honestly, I don't know. Olivia answered, nearly 28%. Heather nodded. What percentage of guest complaints relate to room cleanliness? Olivia responded again. Less than 1%. Heather looked toward Mark. If a department constantly delivers exceptional results. She left the sentence unfinished. Mark understood. Reducing the very employees responsible for that performance suddenly appeared less convincing. He slowly closed that section of the presentation. I may need to revise those recommendations. Heather made another note. I think that would be wise. The conversation continued for another 40 minutes. Technology, marketing, environmental sustainability, community partnerships. Several proposals impressed the committee. Others required additional research. Finally, Mark reached the final slide. Questions. The presentation ended. He quietly turned off the monitor. Thank you for your time. No one spoke immediately. Benjamin reviewed his notes. Olivia organized the evaluation forms. Heather closed her notebook. She looked toward Mark. Thank you for the preparation you clearly invested. He nodded. I appreciate the opportunity. She continued. There are strengths in your proposal. Hope briefly returned to Mark's expression. The conference expansion concept deserves further study. So does your corporate retreat strategy. He waited. Then came the word he sensed before she even spoke it. However, Heather opened one of the financial summaries. The proposal also contains several significant concerns. Mark remained silent. Some financial assumptions rely upon inaccurate comparison properties. She referenced the corrected occupancy data. Several operational recommendations prioritize short-term savings over long-term guest satisfaction. She turned another page. And certain revenue projections cannot currently be supported by available market data. Benjamin slid an evaluation sheet across the table. The committee reached unanimous preliminary findings. Heather looked toward Olivia. Would you summarize them? Olivia nodded. Based on today's review, she spoke carefully. The proposal requires substantial revision before further consideration. Mark lowered his eyes. She continued, "Therefore, the board is unable to approve a consulting partnership at this time." Silence returned. But this silence differed from the one that had followed Heather's introduction. This one carried disappointment rather than shock. Mark closed his laptop slowly. "I understand." Heather watched him for a moment. "This decision is based entirely on the proposal." He looked up. "I know. No other factors influenced today's evaluation." "I believe you." And for the first time since entering the boardroom, he truly did. Because if Heather had wanted revenge, she never would have listened to 90 minutes of presentation. She could have ended the meeting before it began. Instead, she had questioned assumptions, requested evidence, corrected facts, followed procedure, exactly as every responsible owner should. Benjamin collected the remaining documents. "The formal evaluation will be emailed within 48 hours. Mark nodded. "Thank you." He placed his papers back inside the portfolio. Nothing about the rejection felt personal. That realization somehow hurt more. As everyone began standing, Heather spoke once more. "Mr. Reynolds." He stopped. She met his eyes calmly. "I hope you'll revise the proposal." He looked surprised. "You do? I think your company has potential." She paused. "It simply deserves stronger research." Mark stared at her. Less than 24 hours earlier, he had publicly claimed she understood nothing about business. Now she had spent an entire meeting improving his work instead of humiliating him. He suddenly realized which of them had actually demonstrated leadership. And that realization would follow him long after he walked out of the boardroom. Mark Reynolds left the executive boardroom carrying the same leather portfolio he had brought inside. It felt considerably heavier now, not because the documents had changed, because he had. The executive hallway stretched ahead in complete silence. Through the tall windows overlooking Lake Evergreen, afternoon sunlight reflected peacefully across the water. Guests wandered between gardens, unaware that one of the most important conversations of Mark's life had just ended a few floors above them. He walked without destination. His mind replayed every moment from the previous 24 hours. Heather quietly entering the boardroom, Olivia introducing her as owner, Benjamin laying legal documents across the table, his own jokes from the reunion dinner, the laughter, the applause, the certainty. Each memory now returned, carrying an entirely different meaning. He reached an empty terrace overlooking the lake and lowered himself onto a wooden bench. For the first time in years, he had no interest in checking emails. No desire to answer business calls. No instinct to post photographs celebrating another successful meeting. Instead, he stared at the water. Somewhere behind him, a phone vibrated repeatedly inside his jacket. He ignored it. Inside the executive offices, the meeting had not truly ended. Benjamin Carter remained seated beside Heather, organizing legal files into separate folders. Olivia Bennett closed the conference room doors before returning to the table. "No confrontation," Olivia observed quietly. Heather looked up. "There didn't need to be one." Benjamin smiled faintly. "I've represented corporate clients for over 30 years. He adjusted his glasses. "I've watched billion-dollar lawsuits begin with less restraint than you showed this afternoon." Heather closed her notebook. "I wasn't evaluating my husband." She paused. "I was evaluating a consulting proposal." Benjamin nodded. "And that's exactly what the minutes will reflect." He handed her the official evaluation summary. Heather reviewed each page carefully before signing. Every recommendation, every observation, every financial concern, each comment had been documented before the meeting concluded. Nothing had been added afterward. Nothing had been exaggerated. The legal record reflected only facts, Benjamin collected the signed documents. I'll email the official report tomorrow morning. Heather thought for a moment. Send it exactly as written. I plan to. No additional explanation. No special treatment. Benjamin smiled. I suspected that would be your instruction. Olivia leaned back thoughtfully. You know he'll eventually understand what happened. Heather looked toward the lake through the conference room windows. I hope he understands why it happened. At almost the same moment, Ethan Brooks noticed Mark sitting alone outside. He carried 2 cups of coffee across the terrace. Mind if I join you? Mark looked up slowly. Please. Ethan handed him 1 cup before taking the opposite chair. For several minutes, neither man spoke. The silence felt comfortable. Ethan had spent 2 decades working in operating rooms. He understood that some moments required patience instead of conversation. Finally, Mark broke the silence. Did you know? Ethan looked at him. About Heather? Mark nodded. No. You had no idea? None. Mark stared into his coffee. Neither did I. The words sounded almost unbelievable. Ethan answered honestly. I don't think that's entirely true. Mark frowned. What do you mean? I think you stopped paying attention. Mark looked away. A breeze moved gently through the pine trees surrounding the terrace. I thought I knew everything about my own wife. You knew the version you decided to see. Mark remained silent. Ethan continued carefully. Last night wasn't really about the resort. Mark said nothing. It was about respect. Those words settled heavily between them. Mark remembered Heather answering only once during the dinner. People often mean more than they realize when they repeat the same joke. At the time, he had laughed. Now the sentence sounded painfully precise. Later that afternoon, reunion guests gathered near the lakeside lawn for photographs. The organizing committee wanted one final group picture before evening activities began. Rows of former classmates assembled beneath towering pine trees. Photographers adjusted cameras. People laughed while finding old friends. Heather arrived a few minutes later. She had changed into a light blue sweater after the executive meeting, looking no different from any other guest enjoying a weekend reunion. Several classmates greeted her warmly. Lauren Evans approached first. Heather? Heather smiled. Lauren, I've been looking for you. For me? Lauren hesitated. I wanted to apologize. Heather looked puzzled. For what? I laughed. Heather thought back. At dinner. Lauren nodded slowly. I shouldn't have. Heather answered gently. You weren't the only one. I still regret it. Heather touched Lauren's arm lightly. We've all laughed at something we later wished we hadn't. Lauren looked relieved. You aren't angry, Heather smiled. No. Before Lauren could respond, Amanda Collins approached. Heather. Amanda looked noticeably uncomfortable. I owe you an apology, too. Heather shook her head. You don't owe me anything. I should have said something. You weren't responsible for Mark's words. Amanda sighed. I still wish I'd spoken. Heather nodded thoughtfully. Sometimes silence protects peace. She paused. Sometimes it protects the wrong person. Amanda lowered her eyes. I understand. Nearby, Jason Miller watched the conversation from several yards away. He slowly walked over. Heather. She greeted him politely. Jason. I heard something this afternoon. Heather said nothing. I didn't believe it at first. She smiled slightly. That's understandable. Jason rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. So, he laughed softly. You actually own this place? Heather answered simply. Yes. Jason looked around the resort. I spent all last night talking about investment strategies. You did? I had no idea. Heather smiled. Very few people did. Jason shook his head. I feel ridiculous. Heather answered with quiet sincerity. There's no reason to. You never pretended. Neither did I. Jason laughed again. I suppose that's true. The photographer called everyone into position. Classmates arranged themselves in several rows. Heather naturally stepped toward the back. Before she reached her place, the photographer paused. Excuse me. Heather looked over. Would you mind standing closer to the center? She smiled politely. I'm fine here. Olivia Bennett happened to be walking nearby while supervising event staff. Without thinking, she addressed the photographer. Miss Thompson can stand wherever she prefers. Several classmates turned. Olivia immediately realized what she had said. The title, not owner, not chairwoman, simply Miss Thompson. Professional, respectful. Yet somehow different enough that several people exchanged curious glances. Heather offered Olivia a reassuring smile. Everything was still under control. The photograph proceeded normally. No announcements, no speeches, no dramatic revelations, only classmates smiling toward the camera. Yet whispers quietly spread afterward. Did you hear? Is it true someone said Heather bought the resort? No way. Apparently, she really did. Mark overheard fragments of those conversations while walking back from the terrace. No one laughed now. No one repeated yesterday's jokes. Instead, people spoke quietly, carefully, respectfully. Not because Heather demanded respect, because truth had quietly changed the room. That evening, Benjamin Carter returned to his hotel suite after finishing several legal emails. Before closing his laptop, one notification appeared from the resort's accounting department. Ownership transfer completed across all financial systems. Authorized signatures updated. Banking permissions confirmed. Vendor accounts transferred. Everything had been finalized. Benjamin smiled. He forwarded the confirmation to Heather with one short message. Every record is complete. Heather received the email while sitting alone on the balcony outside her suite. She read it once, then closed the laptop. Legal ownership no longer required signatures. The process had ended. What remained unfinished was her marriage. She looked across the moonlit lake where lights from the resort reflected softly upon the water. Inside the suite behind her, Mark had still not returned. Somewhere on the property, he was almost certainly trying to understand how he had become a stranger to the woman he thought he knew better than anyone else. Heather opened her notebook one final time before bed. She wrote only a single sentence. The law completed the acquisition yesterday. The truth completed it today. She closed the notebook. Tomorrow morning would bring conversations neither she nor Mark could postpone any longer. Mark Reynolds did not return to the suite until nearly midnight. Heather was still awake, not because she had been waiting for him. She had simply been reading through several operational reports Olivia Bennett had forwarded after the executive meeting. Employee retention statistics, guest satisfaction surveys, maintenance schedules, the ordinary documents that kept an extraordinary property functioning. She closed the folder when the door opened. Mark stepped inside quietly. His dinner jacket hung over one shoulder. His tie had disappeared hours earlier. He looked exhausted in a way Heather had never seen before. Not physically, mentally. He stood near the entrance for several seconds before speaking. I walked around the lake. Heather nodded gently. It's peaceful at night. It is. Another silence followed. This one felt different from the silences they had shared throughout the weekend. It was no longer built from avoidance. It was built from uncertainty. Mark finally walked farther into the room. I don't know where to start. Heather answered honestly. You don't have to start tonight. I think I do. She looked at him calmly. He took a slow breath. When did all of this begin? The acquisition. He nodded. 8 months ago. No. He shook his head. I mean, his voice faltered. When did I stop knowing my own wife? Heather didn't answer immediately, because the question deserved more than the first thought that came to mind. I don't think it happened all at once. Mark lowered himself into the chair opposite her. I keep replaying yesterday. So do I. I sounded... He struggled to finish the sentence. Heather completed it quietly. Different than the man I married. Mark closed his eyes. Yes. The admission hung heavily in the room. Heather wasn't interested in making it heavier. I've been asking myself something. Mark looked up. What? Whether yesterday surprised me. He waited. It didn't. Those 2 words hurt more than any accusation could have. Mark stared at the floor. You expected it? I hoped I was wrong. Neither spoke for nearly a minute. Finally, Mark asked the question that had been following him since the boardroom meeting. Why didn't you ever tell me about the trust? Heather folded her hands together. I almost did. When? The first year we were married. He looked surprised. I remember sitting at our kitchen table. She smiled faintly at the memory. You were worried that people would think you succeeded because of my father. Mark nodded slowly. I remember saying that. You told me you wanted to build everything yourself. I did. So I decided not to tell you. Mark frowned. You decided for both of us. Heather accepted that. Yes. I thought I was protecting something. Our marriage, she nodded. I wanted you to know that every achievement belonged to you. Mark gave a bitter laugh. And somehow I turned that into believing you had none of your own. Heather said nothing. There was nothing to add. The truth had already reached him. The following morning, the reunion committee organized a farewell brunch inside the resort's largest dining room. Compared to the previous evening, the atmosphere had changed noticeably. Conversations remained friendly, but they carried a new caution, not fear, respect. Word had spread overnight. No formal announcement had ever been made, yet everyone now understood that Heather Thompson owned Lake Evergreen Resort. Nobody treated her like a celebrity. Instead, people approached her with quiet curiosity. Jason Miller found her near the coffee station. I've been thinking. Heather smiled. About the way you handled yesterday. She waited. If I'd been in your position. He laughed softly. I probably would have embarrassed Mark in front of everyone. Heather stirred cream into her coffee. I don't think that would have improved anything. Jason nodded. You're probably right. He looked around the dining room. You know, I spent years believing the strongest negotiators were the loudest ones. And now, I think I was wrong. Before Heather could answer, Amanda Collins joined them. Heather. Good morning. Amanda hesitated. I've already apologized once. You have. But there's something else. Heather listened. I work in television. Amanda looked almost embarrassed. I've spent my career reporting on powerful people. She smiled sadly, and somehow I completely missed the strongest person sitting at our table. Heather shook her head gently. You weren't looking for strength. Amanda understood immediately. I was looking for status. Heather didn't deny it. Because it was true. Across the room, Mark stood alone near one of the windows. No one avoided him. Several classmates still spoke with him. Yet, something had undeniably shifted. The effortless admiration he had enjoyed throughout the first evening had disappeared. Not because anyone mocked him, because they had witnessed something impossible to ignore. Character. Ethan Brooks eventually walked over carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Again?" Mark asked. Ethan smiled. "It seemed to help yesterday." Mark accepted one. "Thanks." Ethan leaned against the window. "I've been thinking about something." Mark looked at him. "In medicine, we sometimes lose patience." Mark remained quiet. "No matter how skilled we are." Ethan continued. "The hardest part isn't making the mistake. It's recognizing it before making another." Mark stared across the lake. "I don't know if Heather can forgive me." Ethan answered honestly, "I don't know either." Mark nodded. "But forgiveness isn't something you earn by asking once." "No. It's something you become worthy of." Shortly before noon, Olivia Bennett approached Heather discreetly. "May I borrow a few minutes?" "Of course." They stepped into the executive lounge, overlooking the gardens. Olivia handed Heather a sealed envelope. "The board completed yesterday's follow-up review." Heather opened it. Inside lay the official executive recommendation regarding Reynolds Strategic Consulting. Benjamin had already prepared the final legal language. Recommendation. Proposal declined pending comprehensive revision. Reason: insufficient operational research, unsupported financial assumptions, inadequate employee impact analysis. Heather read every page carefully. Everything matched the committee's discussion. Nothing had been added, nothing removed. She signed the authorization. Olivia accepted the document. "I wanted to ask you something." Heather looked up. "If Mr. Reynolds submits a revised proposal 6 months from now..." She paused. "Or should we accept it for review?" Heather answered without hesitation. "If it meets our standards. No exceptions. No exceptions. No penalties." Heather smiled gently. "The company isn't responsible for our marriage." Olivia looked at her with quiet admiration. "I've worked in hospitality for 23 years. She shook her head slightly. "I've never seen someone separate personal pain from professional responsibility the way you do." Heather looked out toward the gardens. "It isn't easy. I didn't think it was." "There were moments yesterday," Heather admitted quietly, "when I wanted to end the meeting before it began." Olivia waited. "My father taught me something." "What?" "If power changes your principles." She smiled faintly. "Then power owns you." That afternoon, as reunion guests prepared to leave the resort, Benjamin Carter arrived with one final folder. "I wanted to deliver this personally." Heather accepted it. "The preliminary financial review?" Benjamin nodded. "We've completed the first audit of marital finances." Heather opened the folder. Inside were bank statements, credit reports, loan disclosures, investment records. Benjamin spoke carefully. "Nothing here suggests criminal activity." Heather looked relieved. "But there are serious financial issues." He pointed toward several highlighted pages. "Over the last 3 years, Mark obtained multiple business loans." Heather studied the documents. "He never mentioned these." Benjamin nodded. "Several were personally guaranteed." She turned another page. A larger figure immediately caught her attention. "There are additional liabilities tied to his consulting company." Benjamin continued. "They don't legally affect the resort." "No. But they may become relevant during divorce proceedings." Heather slowly closed the folder. The word hung quietly between them. Divorce. Until that moment, neither of them had spoken it aloud. Benjamin asked gently, "What would you like me to do?" Heather looked through the windows toward the lake where guests loaded luggage into waiting cars. Among them, she could see Mark helping an elderly professor place suitcases into a vehicle. He still offered kindness to strangers. She wondered when he had stopped offering the same care inside his own marriage. Finally, she answered, "Complete the financial review." Benjamin nodded. "And after that?" Heather took a long breath. "After that," her voice remained steady, "we'll follow the law. Nothing more, nothing less. Because revenge had never been her destination. Justice would be. And justice always began with facts. 3 days after the reunion ended, life appeared to return to normal, at least from the outside. Mark Reynolds returned to his consulting office in downtown Denver. Heather Thompson resumed overseeing the transition at Lake Evergreen Resort while continuing her responsibilities at Thompson Legacy Holdings. Neither spoke publicly about what had happened. No photographs from the reunion appeared on social media. No dramatic stories circulated through local business publications. The silence was intentional. Heather had requested absolute discretion from everyone involved. Olivia Bennett honored that request. Benjamin Carter honored it as well. Even Jason Miller and Amanda Collins resisted the temptation to tell an extraordinary story that was not theirs to share. The weekend slowly disappeared from public conversation. It never disappeared from Mark's mind. Monday morning. Heather arrived at Thompson Capital Management shortly before 8. Benjamin Carter was already waiting in the legal conference room. Several thick binders rested neatly arranged across the polished table. An independent forensic accountant sat beside him. "Good morning, Heather." She greeted both of them. "Morning, Ben." Benjamin introduced the woman beside him. "This is Sarah Mitchell." Sarah stood and offered a handshake. "It's nice to meet you." Heather returned it. "Thank you for coming." Sarah Mitchell had spent nearly 25 years conducting financial audits for corporations, family trusts, and civil litigation. Her reputation rested on one principle. She reported facts, not opinions. Benjamin opened the first binder. "As requested, we've completed a preliminary review of marital finances." Heather nodded. "I'd like to understand everything before making any decisions." "You will." Sarah slid several spreadsheets across the table. "We examined the last 5 years. Income, assets, loans, tax filings, business records, personal accounts. Everything had been collected through legal channels. Everything could be verified independently." Sarah spoke calmly. "First, I'd like to make something clear." Heather listened. "We found no evidence that Mark attempted to steal from you." Heather quietly exhaled. That mattered. Sarah continued. "However, we identified repeated failures to disclose significant financial obligations." She pointed toward a highlighted section. 3 years ago, Reynolds Strategic Consulting secured a commercial expansion loan. Heather studied the paperwork. She remembered that period. Mark had simply told her business was growing. He had never mentioned borrowing nearly $2 million. Sarah turned another page. 18 months later, the company obtained a second line of credit. Again, no disclosure. Benjamin added quietly, "Colorado law doesn't automatically require spouses to participate in every business decision." Heather nodded. But failing to disclose major financial exposure during joint financial planning can become highly relevant during divorce proceedings. Heather remained silent. Sarah continued reviewing the records. There were also several personal guarantees. Heather looked at the documents. Mark had personally guaranteed portions of corporate debt without discussing them. She wasn't angry. She was surprised. For years, they had maintained monthly conversations about household finances, or at least, she believed they had. Sarah opened another folder. This concerns household expenditures. Heather expected extravagant purchases, luxury cars, hidden properties, secret vacations. Instead, the records showed something else. Expensive watches, designer clothing, private business club memberships, executive conferences, high-end networking events. Benjamin looked toward Heather. Most expenses relate directly to maintaining his professional image. Heather nodded slowly. She recognized many of them. Mark had always insisted appearance mattered in consulting. She had agreed, within reason. Sarah continued. The issue isn't necessarily the spending. It's the financing. She pointed towards several credit statements. Many purchases had been placed on revolving business credit rather than paid immediately. Interest accumulated. Debt quietly expanded. Heather closed the folder for a moment. So he wasn't pretending to be successful? Sarah answered carefully. No, he was successful, but he was also trying to appear even more successful than reality required. Benjamin folded his hands together. That's an important distinction. Heather looked down at the reports. She suddenly remembered the reunion dinner, the expensive watch, the tailored dinner jacket, the confidence. How much of it had been genuine? How much had been purchased simply to maintain an image? Later that afternoon, Heather drove to Lake Evergreen Resort. Construction crews had already begun repairing several guest cabins. Gardeners replanted seasonal flowers. Maintenance teams inspected roof structures damaged during winter storms. The resort felt energetic, purposeful. Olivia Bennett greeted Heather near the main entrance. Good afternoon. How's everything going? Olivia smiled. Busy. The best kind of busy. They walked together through the property. Employees greeted Heather naturally, not because she owned the resort, because she had learned their names. Housekeepers, gardeners, kitchen supervisors, maintenance technicians. William Thompson had once told her that remembering someone's name often mattered more than remembering their title. She never forgot that lesson. As they passed the employee dining room, Olivia spoke quietly. I've received several applications for the consulting project. Heather nodded. When does the review committee meet? Next Thursday. Include Reynolds Strategic Consulting if they resubmit. Olivia looked surprised. They haven't. Not yet. Olivia hesitated. You really would consider them again? Heather stopped walking. If they improve the proposal? Yes. No favoritism. No punishment. Olivia smiled. I already knew the answer. Across town, Mark sat alone inside his office long after every employee had gone home. The rejected proposal lay open across his desk. Beside it rested Heather's handwritten comments from the executive review. He had requested copies, not because he intended to argue, because he intended to understand. Each note reflected careful analysis. Question occupancy assumptions. Review employee retention impact. Verify seasonal revenue comparisons. Confirm local supplier costs. Nothing personal, nothing emotional. Only professional observations. Mark slowly opened his laptop. He began rebuilding the proposal from the beginning, deleting slides, correcting projections, replacing assumptions with verified research. Hours passed unnoticed. Near midnight, his office phone rang. He almost ignored it. Instead, he answered. Mark. The voice belonged to Jason Miller. Still working. Mark looked around the empty office. Yeah. Jason laughed softly. I figured. A brief silence followed. Then Jason spoke more seriously. I wanted to tell you something. What? I met Heather again yesterday. Mark listened carefully. We discussed the resort. And she never criticized you. Mark closed his eyes. Not once. Not once. Jason continued. I actually tried bringing up the reunion. What did she say? She changed the subject. Mark lowered his head. That sounds like Heather. It does. Jason hesitated. I've been thinking. I always admired successful people. Mark waited. But after last weekend, Jason smiled faintly. I think I admire decent people more. The call ended a few minutes later. Mark remained seated in silence. 2 days afterward, Benjamin Carter arrived at Heather's office carrying another folder. We've completed the review. Heather invited him to sit. Benjamin placed the documents carefully on the desk. The financial findings are complete. Heather opened the report. Every page contained supporting documentation. Bank statements, loan agreements, corporate filings, credit records, tax documents. Nothing speculative. Benjamin spoke calmly. There is sufficient documentation for divorce counsel to evaluate financial disclosure issues. Heather continued reading. We also reviewed communications. He handed her another folder. Printed emails. Mostly business correspondence, meeting schedules, loan approvals, corporate negotiations. One email caught Heather's attention. Subject: personal financial strategy. Mark had written to his financial advisor nearly a year earlier. One sentence stood out. I don't want Heather worrying about business debt until everything is under control. Heather read it twice, then a third time. Benjamin quietly observed her reaction. He wasn't trying to deceive you for personal gain. No. He appears to have believed he was protecting you. Heather nodded slowly. Poorly, Benjamin agreed. Very. She closed the folder. I appreciate knowing the difference. Benjamin looked at her carefully. It may influence how you proceed. It already does. He waited. Heather looked out the office window. Keeping secrets out of pride, she paused, is different from keeping secrets out of fear. Benjamin nodded. Legally, perhaps, not always. But personally, Heather finished the thought. Personally, intentions still matter. Benjamin smiled slightly. That's a very Heather Thompson answer. She almost laughed. My father would have said the same. Benjamin stood. I'll prepare everything. Heather looked up. For the divorce. He nodded once. She remained silent for several moments. Finally, prepare the documents. Benjamin collected the folders. And if he asks to meet, Heather thought carefully. I'll listen. She paused. But listening doesn't mean the decision changes. Benjamin understood. Facts had now replaced uncertainty. The financial review was complete. The legal foundation existed. Every bank record, every email, every document. Properly organized, properly verified, properly admissible. The next step would no longer concern business. It would concern the future of a marriage that had quietly fractured long before either spouse admitted it alone. Fan 13. 2 weeks passed before Mark Reynolds called. Heather recognized his number immediately. She let the phone ring twice before answering. Hello? Hi. His voice sounded calmer than it had during the days immediately following the reunion. Do you have a few minutes? I do. I was hoping we could meet. Heather remained quiet. Not to argue. He continued before she could answer. Not to convince you of anything. She listened. I just think we owe each other one honest conversation. Heather looked in through the windows of her office toward the mountains beyond downtown Denver. There had once been a time when honest conversations came naturally between them. I'll meet you. Thank you. Tomorrow afternoon. Where? She thought for a moment. The coffee shop near the university. Mark understood immediately. The small cafe stood only a few blocks from the campus where they had first met as students. Some places carried memories neither of them wished to erase. The following afternoon, Heather arrived first. Very little had changed inside the cafe. The same wooden tables, the same bookshelves lining one wall, the same quiet music drifting through the room. Even the large oak tree outside still shaded the front windows. Heather chose the table where they had often studied together 15 years earlier. Mark entered exactly on time. For a moment, neither spoke. He looked older, not because 2 weeks had dramatically changed his appearance, because regret had settled across his face with unusual permanence. Thank you for coming. Heather nodded toward the empty chair. Please. After ordering coffee, they sat in silence until the server walked away. Mark finally spoke. I've replayed that weekend 1,000 times. Heather believed him. I know. I've apologized in my head more times than I can count. She waited. But apologies inside my own mind don't help you. No. They only help me. Heather wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. What would you like to say? Mark looked directly at her. I was cruel. The words arrived without excuses, without qualifications, without blaming stress or alcohol. Heather appreciated that. I confused success with superiority. He continued. I started believing I deserved admiration. His voice grew quieter, and somewhere along the way, I stopped treating the person closest to me with the respect I gave complete strangers. Heather listened without interruption. Mark reached into his briefcase. I brought something. He placed a folder on the table. My revised proposal. Heather looked at it but did not open it. I finished it yesterday. I hope it meets your standards. She smiled faintly. You don't need my approval. No. I need your honesty. Heather slowly opened the folder. She immediately noticed the differences. Every financial projection had been rebuilt. Employee interviews had been conducted. Maintenance reports referenced actual resort operations. Local supplier partnerships had been analyzed instead of eliminated. She turned several more pages. Entire sections had been rewritten. You spoke with the housekeeping staff. Mark nodded. 23 of them. The maintenance department. Every supervisor. The kitchen. I spent 4 days there. Heather closed the proposal. This is much better. Mark smiled for the first time. A lot of that is because of your comments. Heather looked at him. You did the work. He nodded slowly. Because I finally understood something. What? I've spent years believing expertise meant having answers. He looked out the cafe window. You reminded me it starts with asking better questions. Heather said nothing. The compliment felt sincere, not manipulative, simply true. After another quiet moment, Mark spoke again. I also met with my financial advisor. Heather waited. I disclosed everything. The loans, the guarantees, the debt. He lowered his eyes. I should have told you years ago. Yes. I thought I was protecting you. Heather answered gently. You were protecting the image you wanted me to have of you. Mark closed his eyes briefly. You're right. Benjamin Carter reviewed the revised proposal later that week. He entered Heather's office carrying a thick binder. I've finished. Heather looked up. And Benjamin smiled. I almost didn't recognize it. She laughed softly. That much better, he nodded. The research is thorough. The financial assumptions are realistic. The employee analysis is excellent. Heather accepted the report. So, I recommend inviting Reynolds Strategic Consulting to the second review. Heather looked at him. As legal counsel, as someone who's reviewed thousands of commercial proposals. She nodded. Schedule the meeting. Benjamin hesitated. You understand people may question the decision. They can, because he's your husband. Heather corrected him quietly. My husband for now. Benjamin understood. The divorce paperwork had also reached an important stage. Benjamin placed another folder beside the proposal. The petition is ready. Heather stared at it for several seconds. Months earlier, she would never have imagined seeing those papers. Now they felt almost inevitable. Benjamin spoke gently. You don't have to sign today. Heather looked toward the window. What happens if I wait? Nothing. And if I sign? We begin formal proceedings. Heather rested one hand on the folder. She remembered their first apartment, their wedding, the nights spent planning dreams together. She also remembered the reunion dinner, the jokes, the laughter, the years of slowly disappearing respect. Some marriages ended because people stopped loving each other. Others ended because one person gradually stopped seeing the other. She wasn't entirely sure which was sadder. Benjamin quietly stood. I'll give you a few minutes. After he left, Heather remained alone. She opened the petition. Every page reflected months of careful legal preparation. No dramatic accusations, no emotional language, only facts, irreconcilable differences, financial disclosure concerns, division of property according to Colorado law, professional, measured, respectful. She picked up the pen, paused, then signed her name. Not because she hated Mark, because she could no longer build a marriage on memories alone. Later that afternoon, Benjamin filed the petition electronically with the district court. Confirmation arrived less than 30 minutes later. Case accepted, service authorized. Benjamin immediately called Heather. It's done. She closed her eyes briefly. I know. I'll arrange formal service tomorrow. Please. Benjamin hesitated. Would you prefer he receive the documents through his attorney? Heather answered without hesitation. Yes. No surprises. No embarrassment. Benjamin smiled sadly. That's consistent. It should be. The following morning, Mark arrived at his office to find his attorney waiting. David Foster stood beside the conference table, holding a sealed envelope. Morning. Mark immediately understood. It's time. David nodded. I'm afraid so. He handed over the documents. Mark opened them carefully. He read every page. He never raised his voice, never argued, never accused Heather of acting unfairly. When he finished, he simply closed the folder. I expected this. David looked at him. Do you want to contest anything? Mark stared quietly through the office windows. No. Property division? No. The business? No. David frowned slightly. You understand you have legal rights? Mark nodded. I do. He paused. But having rights doesn't always mean you're owed another chance. David remained silent. Mark looked once more at Heather's signature on the final page. Perfectly steady, perfectly clear, just like every decision she had made throughout the entire ordeal. For the first time, he fully understood something that had escaped him for years. Heather Thompson had never needed wealth to possess strength. She had always carried it within her character. The resort simply allowed everyone else to see what he had stopped noticing long ago. And now, the law would quietly finish what pride had begun. Autumn arrived gently across the Colorado mountains. The aspens surrounding Lake Evergreen Resort turned brilliant shades of gold, while the pine forests remained deep green against the crisp blue sky. Guests arrived carrying hiking boots instead of summer beach towels. Conference groups replaced reunion weekends. Families gathered around outdoor fire pits in the evenings, watching the first snow dust distant peaks. The resort had entered a new season. So had Heather Thompson. Nearly 5 months had passed since the reunion. The divorce proceedings moved steadily through the legal system without unnecessary conflict. Attorneys exchanged documents. Financial disclosures were completed. Property division followed the prenuptial agreement, and Colorado law almost exactly as Benjamin Carter had predicted. There were no dramatic courtroom confrontations, no angry interviews, no public accusations, only paperwork, meetings, signatures. Justice rarely looked dramatic when everyone respected the process. Heather preferred it that way. Monday morning began with the weekly executive meeting. Department heads gathered inside the same boardroom where Mark had once presented his consulting proposal. Olivia Bennett projected the quarterly performance report onto the large screen. Our guest satisfaction rating has increased from 94% to 97%. Several managers smiled. The food and beverage director continued. Restaurant reservations are up 21%. The marketing director added, our corporate retreat bookings are already exceeding next year's forecast. Heather listened carefully. She rarely celebrated numbers before understanding the reasons behind them. What changed most? Olivia answered first. We stopped asking departments to do more with fewer people. Charles Donovan from maintenance nodded. The renovation budget helped. So did replacing outdated equipment. The executive housekeeper smiled. Guest rooms are finished faster. And better. Heather wrote several notes. What about employee turnover? Human Resources Director Melissa Grant looked down at her report. It has fallen by 38%. The room grew noticeably quieter. Everyone understood what that number represented. Experienced employees choosing to stay. Heather looked around the table. That's the result I'm proudest of. Not revenue, not occupancy, people. Because buildings never welcomed guests. People did. After the meeting, Heather walked through the employee dining hall carrying her lunch tray instead of eating inside the executive lounge. Several workers looked surprised. One young housekeeper smiled nervously. Miss Thompson, Heather sat beside her. May I? The woman laughed softly. You don't have to ask. I think I do. They ate together. Heather asked about work schedules, training programs, transportation, child care. She listened far more than she spoke. When lunch ended, she wrote several additional notes. Expand tuition assistance. Review childcare partnerships. Increase maintenance apprenticeship program. Small improvements. Meaningful improvements. Olivia watched the interaction from across the room. Later, she caught up with Heather near the gardens. You've become something of a mystery. Heather smiled. How so? Half the employees still forget you're the owner. Heather laughed quietly. I consider that a compliment. They just think you're another manager. I am another manager. Olivia shook her head. Most owners don't eat in the employee cafeteria. Heather looked toward several gardeners planting new autumn flowers. My father did. Across Denver, Reynolds Strategic Consulting looked different as well. The company occupied the same office, the same conference rooms, the same clients. Yet, Mark Reynolds had quietly changed the way he led it. Monday mornings now began with employee roundtable discussions. Junior analysts attended strategy meetings that once included only executives. Support staff submitted anonymous improvement suggestions every month. Mark listened, sometimes without speaking at all. His assistant, Emily Sanders, noticed the difference first. One afternoon, she entered his office carrying several reports. "I've never seen you revise presentations this many times." Mark smiled. "I used to revise slides. And now, I revise assumptions." Emily laughed. "That's unexpectedly philosophical." Mark looked toward the framed skyline outside his window. "I learned something important." She waited. The people closest to the work usually understand it better than the people giving instructions. Emily nodded. "That's probably true." Mark thought of Heather interviewing housekeepers instead of simply reading industry reports. He understood now. Leadership began with listening. A month later, Benjamin Carter visited Lake Evergreen with unexpected news. Heather welcomed him into her office. "You look pleased." Benjamin smiled. "I am." He handed her a thin folder. The board completed its second evaluation. Heather opened it. Reynolds Strategic Consulting. Recommendation approved for limited pilot partnership. Heather looked up. "They approved it?" Benjamin nodded, unanimously. "What changed?" Benjamin laughed softly. "The proposal." He pointed towards several pages. The committee described it as one of the most thoroughly researched submissions we've reviewed. Heather smiled. "He earned it." Benjamin studied her expression. "You don't sound surprised." "I'm not." "You expected him to improve." "I expected him to listen." Benjamin closed the folder. "Will you tell him?" Heather shook her head. "Olivia should. Professionally. As always." Benjamin nodded. The decision belonged to the company, not to Heather personally. Later that week, Olivia called Mark. "Good afternoon, Mr. Reynolds." "Miss Bennett, I have good news." Mark listened quietly. "The review committee approved your revised proposal." He closed his eyes for a brief moment. "Thank you. The pilot program begins next quarter." "I appreciate the opportunity." Olivia smiled. The committee appreciated the work. Before ending the call, Mark asked one final question. "Was Heather at the meeting?" "Yes." "And," Olivia answered honestly, "she asked more questions than anyone." Mark smiled faintly. "I expected that." "She also voted." "I assumed she would." Olivia hesitated. "You should know something." "What?" "She argued that your proposal deserved exactly the same consideration as every other submission." Mark remained silent. No favors. No penalties. Just standards. After the call ended, Mark sat quietly inside his office. Success should have felt exciting. Instead, it felt humbling. Because for the second time, Heather had chosen fairness when she possessed every opportunity to choose otherwise. Late October brought the annual Harvest Festival to Lake Evergreen Resort. Local farmers sold fresh produce. Artists displayed handmade crafts. Musicians performed beside the lake. Families filled the walking paths. Children laughed beneath colorful autumn trees. Heather moved through the festival without security or special attention. She greeted vendors by name, purchased homemade jam from a local family, stopped to watch children carving pumpkins. The resort no longer felt like an investment. It felt like a community. Charles Donovan approached carrying a clipboard. "Miss Thompson." "Charles, I wanted to show you something." He pointed toward a newly renovated employee housing building. The last apartment was completed yesterday. Heather walked through the finished units. Bright windows, modern kitchens, comfortable furniture. Simple, practical, dignified. Charles smiled proudly. "The staff loves them." Heather looked around quietly. "My father would have liked this." "I think he would have." That evening, after most festival guests had returned to their rooms, Heather stood alone on the same lakeside terrace where Mark had once sat after leaving the boardroom. The water reflected hundreds of tiny lights from the resort. Her phone vibrated. A message from Benjamin. Final divorce hearing scheduled for next Tuesday. Heather read it once, then locked the screen. 5 months earlier, that notification would have overwhelmed her. Now it simply marked another necessary step. She wasn't celebrating the end of her marriage. She was accepting its conclusion. The wind carried the scent of pine trees across the lake. Behind her, employees laughed while cleaning up after the festival. Ahead of her, the mountains disappeared into the evening sky. She opened her notebook. Almost every page from the past several months contained observations, business ideas, legal reminders, personal reflections. Tonight, she wrote only one sentence. "The strongest foundations are built after the weakest illusions fall away." She closed the notebook gently. In just a few days, the court would finalize what both law and time had already acknowledged. After that, only one final conversation remained before Heather Thompson could quietly walk into the next chapter of her life. The final divorce hearing lasted less than 40 minutes. There were no raised voices, no dramatic objections, no emotional speeches designed to impress the courtroom. Only 2 attorneys, 2 clients, a judge, and years of shared history reduced to carefully organized legal documents. Benjamin Carter sat beside Heather Thompson. David Foster represented Mark Reynolds. The judge reviewed the settlement one final time. Both parties confirmed these terms voluntarily. "Yes, Your Honor," Benjamin answered. David nodded. "We do." The judge looked toward Heather. "Miss Thompson?" "Yes." Then toward Mark. "Mr. Reynolds?" Mark held the judge's gaze. "Yes, Your Honor." The judge signed the final order. The sound of the pen touching paper lasted barely a second. 15 years of marriage officially came to an end, without applause, anger, or celebration. Only silence. Heather had imagined this moment many times over the previous months. She expected relief. Instead, she felt something quieter. Acceptance. As they left the courtroom, Benjamin paused beside her. "Everything is complete." Heather nodded. "Thank you. I wish the circumstances had been different." "So do I." Benjamin hesitated. "Will you be all right?" Heather smiled gently. "I've been preparing for this for a long time." He understood what she meant, not the legal process, the emotional one. Mark exited the courthouse through a different hallway. David Foster walked beside him. "I've represented a lot of divorces." Mark looked ahead. "So have I." David smiled faintly. "Then you know most people spend more energy fighting over property than understanding why they lost each other." Mark stopped on the courthouse steps. Snow had begun falling lightly across downtown Denver. "I don't regret losing money." David remained quiet. "I regret noticing who Heather really was, only after everyone else already had." David placed one hand on Mark's shoulder. "Some lessons arrive late. They still matter." Mark nodded slowly. I hope so. Winter settled over Colorado. Lake Evergreen Resort transformed beneath fresh snow. The walking paths were cleared before sunrise each morning. Fireplaces burned continuously inside the main lodge. Families gathered around holiday decorations, while children watched snow fall across the frozen lake. The resort had become one of the highest-rated destinations in the region. Guest satisfaction reached another record. Employee retention continued improving. Local newspapers praised the property's commitment to community partnerships rather than luxury alone. Heather rarely appeared in those articles. Whenever journalists requested interviews, Olivia Bennett usually accepted on behalf of the resort. That had been Heather's preference. Buildings deserved attention. Owners rarely did. William Thompson would have approved. Just before Christmas, a regional hospitality conference selected Lake Evergreen as its venue. Executives from across the western United States arrived for 3 days of meetings. Among the invited consultants, Reynolds Strategic Consulting. Mark accepted the invitation, not because he expected to see Heather, because his company had legitimately earned the contract through months of revised work. On the second afternoon, he stepped outside between sessions. Fresh snow covered the gardens. The lake shimmered beneath pale winter sunlight. He recognized the path immediately, the same one where he had sat after leaving the executive boardroom months earlier. Footsteps approached quietly behind him. He turned. Heather. She wore a dark wool coat gloves and the same calm expression he had known since college. For a brief moment, neither spoke. Then Heather smiled politely. "Good afternoon, Mark." "Good afternoon." He looked toward the conference center. "I heard the event was going well." "It is. The staff has done an excellent job." Heather nodded. "They always do." Another comfortable silence followed, very different from the painful silences they had once shared. Mark finally spoke. "I wanted to thank you." Heather looked at him. "For what?" "For never using your position against me." She answered simply. "It would have been the wrong thing to do. You could have. I could have. But then I would have become someone I never wanted to be." Mark lowered his eyes briefly. "I understand that now." Heather believed he did. Not because he said the words, because she had watched the changes in his company through quarterly reports. Employee retention had improved. Client satisfaction had increased. His revised proposals consistently reflected stronger research and greater attention to people rather than appearances. Growth. Real growth. The kind that couldn't be purchased. Mark looked across the frozen lake. "I used to think success meant everyone admiring me." Heather waited. "Now I think it means becoming someone worth respecting." She smiled softly. "Those aren't always the same thing." "No, they're not." He took a slow breath. "I don't expect forgiveness." Heather answered honestly. "I know. I only hope." He searched for the right words. That one day when you remember me, the reunion won't be the first thing that comes to mind." Heather looked toward the mountains in the distance. "It already isn't." Mark seemed surprised. "It isn't." "No," she smiled. "I remember 2 students sharing cheap coffee during finals." The young man who believed hard work mattered more than image. Mark felt emotion tighten his throat. "I miss that version of myself." Heather nodded gently. "So do I." The words carried no accusation, only truth. A conference organizer called Mark's name from across the courtyard. "They're waiting for me." Heather smiled. "They probably are." He hesitated. "I hope life is good to you." "It already has been." "And the future." Heather looked around the resort. Employees greeted guests by name. Children laughed while building snowmen. A maintenance worker waved as she passed. She waved back. The future is something we build every day. Mark smiled. That sounds like something your father would have said. Heather laughed softly. He did. For the first time since the reunion, both of them laughed at the same memory. Not because the past had been repaired, because it had finally been understood. Mark extended his hand. Heather shook it. No bitterness, no unfinished argument. Just two people acknowledging the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Mark walked back toward the conference center. Heather remained beside the lake for another minute. She watched him disappear inside. Then she turned toward the resort, toward the life she had chosen to continue building. She never looked back. Not because she hated the past, because she no longer needed to live inside it. Some victories arrived through applause. Others arrived through court orders, financial records, careful decisions, and the quiet refusal to abandon one's principles. Heather Thompson discovered that dignity never required the last word. It required only the courage to let truth speak when the time was right. And in the end, truth had spoken more clearly than revenge ever could. For a long time, people assume that strength looks loud. They imagine it arriving with dramatic speeches, public victories, or perfectly timed revenge. Yet, real strength often looks much quieter. It is found in the person who continues to act with integrity after being misunderstood. It is found in the discipline to let facts replace accusations, to let the law replace anger, and to let dignity outlast humiliation. Heather never won because she became more powerful than Mark. She won because she refused to let power change who she was. Even when she had every opportunity to embarrass someone who had embarrassed her, she chose fairness over pride. In doing so, she preserved something far more valuable than a marriage or a business. She preserved her character. Perhaps every one of us will someday face a moment when we can answer hurt with hurt or answer it with wisdom. The choice we make in that moment often defines us far more than the injustice that came before it. If this story stayed with you, we'd love to know where you're watching from and what part of Heather's journey resonated with you the most. If you enjoy thoughtful stories about resilience, justice, and quiet courage, consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Thank you for spending your time with us, and we hope to see you again in the next story.